Okay, this is another video for Philosophy 2310, Theory of Ethics at Marquette University. And we've just finished our discussion of the critique of Aristotle, the feminist critique of Aristotle. And we're moving on to a completely different philosophical approach to ethics. Completely different. This one is by Immanuel Kant, an 18th century philosopher. He's the one who really set up the foundations for the notion that we talk about so much and that I spoke to you about in class as something you learned in kindergarten, and that is the notion of respect, that absolute respect for all human beings. This is something that comes out of the Enlightenment, but also Kant's own reflection. He believes that inside each human being is a notion of respect for other rational beings, and that just needs to be brought to the attention of people, and then they will see it. He doesn't think that this is something new with him, but rather what's new with him is discovering this, that is uncovering it, something that is there in all human beings in a natural way. So that's really very different from what Aristotle is doing. Also, remember, Aristotle's ethics was in the context of society. And it involved looking at the way people act in society, reflecting upon that, and picking out from human actions precisely what the best kind of action is. And then working with that and seeing that as the best kind of action, being a virtuous action, and showing how the buildup of the person's character, that is virtue ethics, an ethics of character, takes place. And then finally uniting that with the notion of prudence and the notion of the intellectual virtues. And then Aristotle, you recall, had two levels of happiness. One for the intellectual, well-trained, well-educated, and very intellectually successful elite, who had the highest kind of rationality available for human beings, and so had the highest kind of happiness, according to Aristotle. And the others who were good citizens, having the second highest kind of happiness, and that is the happiness of a person of good moral virtue. Those were Aristotle's approaches to the notion of happiness. And of course, his ethics, as you recall, is an ethics of eudaimonia, or a eudaimonistic ethic. And that means it's centered on attaining happiness. This, of course, for Aristotle will be the same thing as a virtue ethics, which is founded on the achievement of excellence, which in Aristotle's own thought, the achievement of that excellence puts us in a position where if we have good fortune, we may have a life of happiness. But as I said, Kant is completely different in this. Kant focuses on the individual person with what we call a phenomenological approach, an approach to appearances. That is, we look at reality around us, and we see reality as it appears to us, which is not necessarily how it actually is in itself. Further, Kant thinks that we can't see reality in itself, but only reality as it appears to us. So where do we find the solidity of philosophy, the sound foundation for philosophy for Kant? We find it through a kind of internal approach. We find it inside ourselves. What we can know is what is inside ourselves. We can know the structures of the way we see reality, the way we see the appearances of things. So for Kant, ethics is going to start out with what's inside us. Ethics is not something formed in reaction to or as a consequence of our perception and experiences of the world. Rather, we discover the principles of morality in our very selves. Now, that phenomenological approach that Kant talks about concerns seeing things as they appear to us. So I cannot see my own back right now, so I only see the appearances of myself, perhaps in a mirror. So too, appearances are affected by my taking off my glasses. Now, the camera that I'm staring into and what I'm reading on the screen here and looking at, it's now a bit fuzzier. Now, is it fuzzy in itself, or is it fuzzy because of my perception? I want to use this idea of the glasses to convey what Kant is about in a very important way. Kant thinks that the structures of reality that we perceive, what we perceive in the world, those structures are primarily in ourselves, and it's through those structures that we perceive reality. So right now I'm looking at the screen, it's a bit fuzzy as far as I can see, and now I put on my glasses and the screen is very sharp. So just as these glasses distort the light in a certain way to give me 20/20 vision, Kant thinks that there are structures in the human mind that structure the way we see reality. And one of those structures concerns the way we see other rational beings. According to Kant, if no matter who we are, as long as we're a human being, if you can settle someone down and get them to sit and think about how they see other human beings, they would come to understand that inside of us is a way of seeing all human beings as persons that have value because they have a rational nature. Now, maybe that's a bit optimistic in some respects, but we make these understandings, we see reality through the structures of the mind already. We'll see this later on, because Kant will say that there's no way to prove the existence of free will, but rather we must assume the existence of free will. So that's very different. And again, with regard to scientific laws then, where are the scientific laws? And what are they? Well, scientific laws don't exist in the world. The world doesn't make laws. Rather, the scientific laws exist in us. And we constantly find that we must change many scientific laws as we find out that the reality that the laws are supposed to be describing are very different from what we thought they were. The notion that light always travels in a straight line turns out to be false if it's in a gravitational field. Light can bend under the influence of gravity. This is not something obvious to us in our everyday look at the world. Light seems to go in a straight line. And it seems in our everyday part of the world here, light seems to be instantaneous. It seems not to have a delay. But of course, science has taught us that that's not the case. Light travels at a certain speed. And so as a consequence, these scientific laws are in us. There are ways of apprehending reality that changes as we come to apprehend reality even more. So all of our scientific laws have a certain hypothetical aspect to them in view of what we may anticipate to be future changes, future moments of better understanding reality and the laws. Now you see what we've done now. The knowledge and laws and that sort of thing are in the human mind. So too are morals. Lions and tigers and bears do not have ethics or morals. Of course, we know from Aristotle this is because they don't have the ability to deliberate and decide, right? But nevertheless, here in Kant, those things outside of us, those animals outside of us, do not have the freedom that we have to choose what we do with our actions. And as we choose our actions, we choose what we are as moral persons. That should ring a bell with you because we've already seen that in Aristotle. So the notion that as you develop your character, you are choosing your morality and your moral self, and you are creating it. Now, I've come across in my own mind thinking about how to describe Kant to you, and the book you're about to read, or the book I hope you're already reading, and that is his Grounding the Metaphysics of Morals. The model I want to suggest to you is the model of an onion. Now, an onion that you see in the grocery store, on the outside you see there are leaves of the onion. Usually they're golden and dry. And then when you're going to cook with the onion, you peel them off, the first couple layers of the onion, and then you have the white onion or whatever it's called, or red onion, and you can chop it up and cook with it and that sort of thing. But if you were to keep pulling off the layers of the onion, they would go back and back and back and back until you came to what we call the pearl of the onion, the heart of the onion, the center of the onion, or better, the point from which the onion grows, because the onion grows outward. Now that's what Kant's ethics is about. You can see, we will be discussing this shortly, but you can see the externals of his ethics and say, my goodness, that's an ethical system. That seems to make sense. But the question is, when you peel it back, what's underneath? The grounding of morality is underneath. And you keep peeling back, and you're going deeper and deeper and deeper into the presuppositions or foundations for the entire ethics of Kant. So what we will do with the first section is we'll peel back the onion a little bit, and we'll see something we recognize. We'll recognize the various moral values that we have ourselves. But the question is, what makes them moral values? What gives them the foundation that they have? So we peel back some more, and we look at this in the peeled back version of what's underlying. We look at that in section 2 of Kant. And then we get to section 3, we peel back even more, and eventually we get to the heart of the onion, or the pearl of the onion. And that is that out of which the whole approach grows. So if the pearl of the onion is not sound, the onion does not grow into the large onion we see at the supermarket. And so what are the foundations there at the very heart of his philosophy that are necessary, that must be known, that must be affirmed for the rest of his philosophy to make sense? And that's where we're heading. But I'll use that model again and again with regard to Kant, this idea of an onion being peeled back more and more. So you won't have the full foundations and the full grounding for his metaphysics of morals. That's what he calls it. You won't have the full grounding of that until we get to the center. And you'll also find in much of what Kant is doing, he's making sense of the world we see around us. As we saw with Aristotle, many of the things that are the case in law today were noted by Aristotle with his understanding of morality. So too here with regard to Kant. So much of what you're learning is not new in that sense, but what you're learning is how he came up with that, and what are the intellectual foundations for it. And again, if we want to be very practical, what we're exploring are the intellectual foundations for the notion that every human being deserves respect. Those foundations have connections with religion, perhaps, but they are not primarily religious, according to Kant. They're in us all, insofar as we are rational beings. So let's proceed to look at the preface of his work. Now be prepared, because this is a very different kind of work from anything that we've studied so far, from the Aristotle, very different kind of work. But let's proceed. So, now we're looking at the preface here. One of the first things Kant does is he says all knowledge can be divided into two kinds, material and formal. When he says material, he means concerned with some object, some thing of some kind. By formal, he means concerned only with the form of understanding and reason and the universal rules without regard for the difference of the objects. What's he talking about? The material. Apples. All right? So if you have one apple, you throw it in a bag, and another apple, you throw it in the bag, and then you wonder, gee, I wonder how many apples I have there. Well, you have two apples. Okay, let's now try it with pears. But you have two pears. So the material content are the apples or pears, but the formality remains the same. 1 + 1 is 2. So that's a universal rule, and it's regardless of the differences in objects. That's all he means. Don't read more into him here. But all rational knowledge, then, can be divided into two kinds. One is concerned with some object, and the other is concerned with the structures of rational understanding of these and the rules of thought, regardless of what the content is. So we're looking for universal rules of thought. So formal and material philosophy. We're still in the preface here. So formal philosophy is called logic. And that was the structures. Logic, you can plug in variables just as you can in mathematics. Material philosophy deals with the determined objects and laws to which the objects are subject, like the apples and oranges and pears and that sort of thing. Now, consequently, the formal philosophy here is divided into two parts. One, the laws of nature, or physics, and that's called doctrine of nature. And secondly, the laws of freedom, or ethics, the doctrine of morals. So so there's the laws of freedom and the laws of nature. Now, those are the laws. So we're after the formalities relating to these, and the formalities as they apply to the material. Now, logic itself has no empirical part. Logic can use variables. Logic doesn't depend upon apples and oranges and pears and how fast they rot if they're not stored properly and that sort of thing. It's irrelevant. Logic for Kant then is not based on experience. It has to do with the structures of thought itself and how those structures work with logic. If logic were based on experience, it wouldn't have the universality for all thinking. That is, it wouldn't apply to everything: lions, tigers, bears, pears, trees, everything else. So logic has a universality to it. Hence, in logical expressions we use variables, just as we do in mathematics. Natural and moral philosophy, however, each have an empirical part. That is, a material aspect to them. Okay, and empirical means you can experience it in the world. So while there are formal laws and rules for each of these, there is also a component of experience in the world. For natural philosophy, this involves determining the laws of nature as a result of experience. And we do this. So the laws are formed in our minds. The laws don't exist out there as such. Things exist out in the world, not laws. But the laws are formed in our minds as a result of experience. And our experience tells us that certain objects act in certain ways, and so we attribute to them law-like behavior for so long as the laws, in fact, are laws according to which things do in fact happen in the world. If something in the world happens differently, we may have to revise these laws, as science has done through the centuries. Now, moral philosophy also requires experience for Kant. What kind of experience? Well, it concerns the will of human beings insofar as the will is affected by nature. We saw something like this in Kant, right? Our natural wants, needs, desires sometimes affect our ability to make choices and determinations as to what we want. This was called incontinence. And so our natures, in fact, cause us to desire certain things. And this needs to be taken into account with regard to moral philosophy. So these are the laws according to which everything ought to happen, the laws here. Remember, the laws are the formalities. So if we take into account human beings and human nature, it gives us rules and laws according to which everything ought to happen. And this is moral philosophy, so these will be the moral laws according to which things ought to happen. Although quite frequently what ought to happen does not. In times of war, the weakest, that is children, women, and old people, are supposed to be spared of being involved in military combat. Yet in the real world, in wars, that's not the case. But still, we have those laws according to which things ought to happen. And yet, of course, people break laws as well. So these moral laws are a kind of ideal that we say should be imposed upon the world. So there should be, for example, there should be no instances of sexual assault on Marquette's campus. Moral law requires that. The fact of the matter is, though, that such things do take place on campus. So what we're doing in that case is we are taking absolute moral standards and expecting them to exist in the world. And when they do not, we say someone has violated the moral law, and that person has failed as a moral agent to do what is right. That person has done something which ought not to happen. We'll come back to this later. So philosophy on this account then has two parts. One is called a posteriori and the other is called a priori. These are Latin terms. The definition, a posteriori means found after. After what? Found after experience, or found on the basis of experience. So philosophy founded on experience is then empirical, that is, it is a posteriori. You'll need to know this term, and the term is in our list of definitions, but you need to know this term because a posteriori means based on experience or empirical. And so that would count then as the content. of our experience. On the other hand, philosophy founded on principles prior to experience, that is, a priori principles, this is called pure philosophy. And this is a formal aspect in the sense. It lays out for us what ought to happen, what is morally right to happen for us. And we should act in accordance with that. But again, does in fact what ought to happen take place in the world? No, not always. But still, nevertheless, we do claim that innocent people should not be harmed. We claim that there should be no robberies, there should be no murders, even though this sort of thing, there should be no wars where innocents are harmed. All these sorts of things we claim should not take place, and we regard this as quite often as failures of the human ability to act in accordance with proper morality. And in this case, we're going to see in Kant's philosophy later on that proper morality involves respect. That's the whole foundation for what he's up to, but we'll see that later on. Metaphysics and logic. So, definitions again, we're back to that. When pure philosophy is merely formal, it's logic. Okay, pure philosophy as just formal, it's logic. But when it's limited to determinate objects of the understanding, it's called metaphysics. Okay, let him have his definitions. When we're talking about determinate objects of understanding, we call it metaphysics. When we talk about pure formal philosophy, we have logic. Hence, metaphysics for Kant is of two sorts. There's the metaphysics of nature, and that has to do with the rational part of physics or natural philosophy, philosophy about the natural world. That's the metaphysics of nature. The metaphysics of morals concerns the rational part of ethics. So the rational structure of ethics is metaphysics of morals. So these are the formal structures involved in each. The formal structure of metaphysics of nature is the rational part of physics. The formal structure or metaphysics of morals is the rational part of ethics. Now in this context, Kant makes a very important distinction, a distinction between practical anthropology and morals. Practical anthropology is about anthropology, the study of human beings. Logos means study of, and anthropos means human beings. So practical anthropology will be about the study of human beings in action, in practice. This is over and against morals. So when we want to specify the empirical part, where we look at the world of ethics, we refer to it as practical anthropology. So are innocents hurt, in fact, in wartime? Yes. When specifying the rational part of ethics, we refer to it as morals, but morally it should not happen. That abuse to civilians should not happen. So one is real world, practical anthropology, what in fact happens in the world, and that's over and against morals, which is what should happen in the world and in human interaction. That distinction is going to be very important, and I'll be referring to it again later. So this is important, as it say right here. Pure moral philosophy has to be distinguished from practical anthropology. That there must be moral laws is universally evident. The ground of obligation involved is not from the nature of human beings or from the nature of the world, but rather the ground of moral obligation comes from a priori concepts of pure reason, that is, ideas and notions that are already in us according to Kant. Consider this yourself then. How many sexual assaults should there be on a campus like Marquette's, with the number of students that we have? The moral answer is 0. But in terms of practical anthropology and what happens in the world, there is some average number that takes place from year to year with a population about the size of Marquette, and it takes place at every other university around the United States with populations about the size of Marquette. So this is an important distinction between the two that Kant is making here. And I think I'll stop here because I believe it's almost, no, I won't stop quite yet, but I'm almost at the end of the introduction for Kant, and I'll stop the video there and then I'll do section 1 in another video. So therefore, while reason can find motives for right or good or correct actions in empirical grounds, namely self-interest, love, fighting for our cause, all kinds of reasons we can find motives for doing good actions in empirical grounds, real moral laws are found someplace else, not in experience. And so they must have other grounds than empirical grounds. And those moral grounds are in our minds, or in our reason, as Kant would say. Thus, moral laws and moral philosophy must rest entirely on the pure part of philosophy, specifically on the metaphysics of morals. So what's he saying? Morality depends upon the structures in the human mind relating to other beings. And the rational structures in our minds have to do with morality, and we'll see that one of the laws in the mind is the law of respect. That's absolutely essential for Kant's philosophy. This is the end of the preface of Kant, and I'm going to stop here. And we'll talk about this again at class, but I'm also going to resume later and do the first section of Kant as well. And you should see these first two videos for our next class on Tuesday. So I'll stop here.